So we've had a bit of a look at an ideal scenario for rational decision making, where we've got an 8-step process that we follow. We can analyze everything, and we've got really good analysis that we're basing our decisions on. And then we had a bit of a look at some of the things that might challenge our ability to make good decisions that sit within us as individuals, which are our cognitive biases. And we're going to turn now to the kind of real world, right? So if you have a look at these different decisions that managers are going to be challenged with from either day to day or over the course of their work, you can see that that 8-step process to decision making is not always going to be possible. For one thing, you could spend your whole day just seriously walking through, analysing and creating criteria and ranking criteria and all that sort of thing for every single decision that you're going to make. So as managers, we're going to need to take some shortcuts. We're going to need to use some forms of heuristics, and to be able, and we're going to integrate different kinds of decision making in the way that we approach problems, and the way that we approach the decisions that we make. So today we're going to have a look at 3 different kinds of approaches to decision making that managers use. The first of which is the rational decision-making process, that is what we call bounded rationality. So this is where we've taken our 8-step process, which is all about just trying to make logical, very rational, evidence-based decisions, and we're trying to maximize our value, because as managers, we're interested in efficiency and effectiveness. But that's not always going to be possible. So we will have this technique called bounded rationality. So we take the rational approach, but then we kind of do it to the best of our ability. And we're going to look at a concept called satisficing. And then we'll have a look at intuitive decision making. So part of the challenge of our rational decision model, our 8 steps, it assumes that we are fully objective, and that we're rational. So it sort of puts us as like we're computers that can, crunch numbers and weight things, and that there's no kind of, that we don't have these biases, or that we don't have any interest in the outcome of our decisions. It also assumes that the problem is really unambiguous, right? So often, as we've talked about before, we're going to have conflicting interests. We're going to have different groups or pools that are going to be trying to influence our decisions. And sometimes it's not going to be clear and obvious. Something like buying a car, there's a very tangible, measurable outcome in terms of just, does the car do what it's got to do? Whereas sometimes we're trying to make decisions that they're not going to have a clear, immediate outcome. They might have outcomes years in the making, and they may not also be, it might not be obvious what the outcome is going to be. And so we're dealing a lot with ambiguity, and trying to navigate through that. It also makes the assumption that as a decision maker, you have a really specific and clear goal. And sometimes as managers, we don't. Yeah, we might have a big picture, but someone may come to us and say, oh, can we buy this thing? And you need to make a decision. And it's not necessarily linked to some specific goal, but it might be just there to help enable that person to do their job better, or have some kind of indeterminate reason behind it. And so going through that whole process may not make a lot of sense. It also assumes that every possible alternative and the outcomes of those different alternatives, that we can know what they are. Yeah. So in the case of the car, it's pretty easy to kind of find a list of all the cars that are in perhaps your price range, and then start to analyze all those different cars. But in cases such as like maybe a hiring decision, often we don't necessarily know who are the people that we might be able to hire for this role. Or if we're making a decision on who to sign as an artist, if we're in a management company or a record company, we may not necessarily know all the bands that are out there, and even necessarily which ones might work and which ones might not. And so being able to kind of do some really in-depth analysis is going to be not very useful, because we're not going to be actually able to very accurately predict the outcomes of making those choices. And so often what we'll be left with is a scenario where we're going to need to do our best efforts to look at the alternatives and use a bunch of different techniques in order to work out how might we maximize value in this situation, and how might we start to move forward towards our larger goals without necessarily having a very clear path towards them. So bounded rationality gives us is an idea that means that we have our rational approach, but we kind of understand that it has limits. And so we then need to manage the decisions that we can make within those limits and do our best possible job. And so we use this term called satisficing. So if you think of the idea of something just being satisfactory, it means that it's going to meet a kind of minimum standard, but we're not expecting it to be perfect or for it to necessarily be the best solution. But on balance, given everything that we're kind of working with, and often given all the other demands that we're juggling at the same time, this is the best we can do with the information that we have at hand. And so we consider this to be satisficing. And so what this can lead to, though, is we looked at this a little bit in our bias around sunk costs. And so what tends to happen is that what we can do is once we've made a commitment, we will tend to stick to it. And then what we'll have what then is called an escalation of commitment. So just as an example, a friend of mine is about to give birth, and she was telling me the other day about this thing that they call escalation of intervention. So if they start to intervene in the birth by, say, inducing the baby to bring on birth, because the woman's body hasn't had time to actually get ready to give birth, what then happens is you get this cascade effects where, okay, so the induction's happening, we've done the induction, now the baby's getting in distress because it's kind of stuck, and so now we need to move to giving her a cesarean. And so one thing starts to compound on another, and then you end up with this chain of events that has happened as a result of the first commitment or the first action that was taken. And so this can happen sometimes where we kind of make a decision and then things move forward and then we reach our next decision point. And so we've gone from here to here. And so now our choices that existed here might have disappeared, or they might be different now. And so we've now got to make choices based on being at this position. And so even if we're wrong, we may need to make a decision based on where we are now, because we either can't go back or we don't have those choices anymore. And so this idea of the escalation, and so the increasing complexity or the increasing challenge that comes about as a consequence of that initial commitment can make things difficult if we've made the wrong decision, and we may not always know that until further down the track. And so if we've got a sunk cost problem as well happening there, it can be very hard to reverse course and not try and just kind of navigate our way through. So probably a more common idea of decision making that you would be used to, which is, you know, how most of us live life, right, is through basic intuitive decision making. And sometimes what we call intuition, or we just do things based on, yeah, that'll, you know, we just make a decision. We call it intuition, but there's actually quite a few things going on that underlie this notion of intuitive decision making. And sometimes we'll know which aspect we're drawing on. So it might be that we're making a decision on the basis of our depth of knowledge and experience on the particular issue. Sometimes it'll just be because of a feeling. But let's dig into some of the different elements that come into play when we're actually talking about the idea of intuitive decision making. So this little model gives us a sort of map of the different things that are at play when we talk about intuitive decision making. So most of us would think of this idea of intuition as subconscious mental processing. Yeah, and so this is the idea that you might just kind of go, yeah, I just had a feeling. Just had a feeling that this thing was going to happen, and you might refer to that as intuition. And so you may make decisions using that, just your gut instinct. You know, you see a band and you just think they're fabulous. There's not really any rhyme or reason about it. You just think they're great, and so you want to work with them. And so you might just call that, yeah, I just had a gut feeling they were going to be great, so I want to work with them. We also use our intuition when we're making decisions that are based on our values or ethical orientations. And so this, when we played last week with some of the ethical issues in the music industry, you know, if we're, say, starting a festival, and as part of that festival, we decide that we really want to have a strong commitment to the environment, then we might start to navigate our decisions that we make in that in the formulation of that festival based around the values of wanting to have low environmental impact on that. And so those decisions will be infused and have those values embedded within them. And as we start to kind of go through and say, all right, so what are we going to do for catering, or how are we going to power our venue, you might start to just kind of, without necessarily even realizing it, start to kind of go, all right, we want to find disposable stuff or recycled stuff, we want to find green power sources, etc., etc. We'll also make decisions based on our experience. So while we need to be cautious and aware of our cognitive biases that can come into play with that, so, you know, because something has worked in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work in the future. And similarly, you know, often what people do is if something didn't work once, they won't do it again. And so that's another example of that representational bias where we go, oh yeah, we signed this band, this heavy metal band, and they tanked, so we don't work with heavy metal bands anymore. And it's purely because on the basis of that one experience that you had, you're going to make future decisions on the basis of that experience. But also, our learned body of experience over time will give us knowledge that we will then intuitively rely on as well. Yeah, so if you're someone that's grown up around cars, unlike me, who didn't grow up around cars and has no interest in cars, if you've had from a kid, you've been tinkering with cars and your family talked about cars and you know, you're going to know the lingo. Like, I couldn't tell you one technical term that would be anything to do with a car. But so then when it comes to actually buying a car, you're going to be much more intuitively able to make those decisions than someone like me who doesn't have that experience that's attached to the decision that's being made. And then sort of in line with that, we have this cognitive based decisions, which is where we're basing our decisions based on those skills and knowledge that we have. So again, if you grew up around cars, you might have embodied that knowledge that I haven't, or similarly, you might have then gone and done some training. You might have read a lot of books on cars that I haven't. And so you're going to be able to not only just kind of know from, you know, kind of just, it'll just be obvious to you, but you might also be able to do that cognitive thinking process that goes, yeah, well, this car, I know this, this, and this, and you'll be able to recall specific bits of knowledge. You'll be able to synthesize that knowledge to come to conclusions around, well, this car has a blah, blah, something, and this one has a blah, blah, something. And so based on that, this one's slightly better for that reason. So you're going to be able to go beyond just that kind of gut experience-based knowledge to being able to actually think and process based on that knowledge as well. And then our last element of intuition is what we call affect-initiated decisions. Affect is kind of another word for emotion. So you can just think of it as intuition that comes from our emotions. And so this is the kind of thing often that we'll refer to as intuition as well, which might be, you know, you're walking along a dark street at night and you just get a creepy feeling, and then it seems like someone's following you. Anytime we have that just visceral response to something, or, you know, when you meet the love of your life and you have that moment and you just say, I just knew. And it was because of the emotions that that experience generated in you that it created this intuition that told you that this situation was good, and that you wanted to pursue more of it, as opposed to that it was bad, or that it was a bit, nah, I don't want this. And so these 5 elements of and aspects of intuition and decision making are often very much at the fore as we just in our day-to-day have to navigate the world and make decisions. And so there are 3 different approaches that we can think of. We have our very rational, 8 steps, do all the analysis. We have our bounded rational, where we're satisficing, so we're doing our best to get as much information as we can, and then we're making the best decision that we can based on what's available to us. And then we have our more intuitive approach, where we're kind of bringing together everything that's, let's call it, inside us, in order to make those decisions. And often we'll use these in combination as well.